All right, guys, listen, if there's one thing I've learned by making YouTube videos, it's that you gotta have thick skin for all the comments. So listen, if you're the kind of guy that already knows everything there is to know about camshafts and manifolds and tuning engines, you can go ahead and do us both a favor and just switch off this video right now. It's not for you. However, if you're the kind of guy that says, hey, you know what? I can learn something from anybody, so I'm gonna follow along and just see if there's a nugget I can get, then stick around, because today I'm gonna talk to you about tuning your engine's individual cylinders using the Lash on your camshaft. All right, well, you know, I've made a name for myself in the industry building a lot of really high-end, high RPM, high-powered racing engines, and one of the things that you start to learn right away, especially when you get access to really cool equipment like in-cylinder combustion, pressure transducers, dynos, you know, racetrack data and all that kind of stuff, is that we're not really dealing with one 8-cylinder engine. In the case of a V8, for example, it's not one engine with 8 cylinders. You start to learn that it's really 8 one-cylinder engines all working together or sometimes against each other. And so oftentimes the subject of individual cylinder tuning comes up. Now, lots of people talk about tuning the individual cylinders, fuel delivery or spark timing or otherwise, but I want to talk to you about how we can literally change the behavior of that cylinder using something called Lash. Now, to be honest, the Lash really mostly deals with solid lifter camshafts where you don't have an oil-filled hydraulic lifter. And the Lash is there. It's typically going to be given to you as a suggested value on your cam card. So I got a couple here we're going to look at later. But what it really means is it's the clearance between the end of your rocker arm and the tip on your valve here. So typically I'm going to have a set of feeler gauges. I'm going to pick a value here. And when the engine's all assembled, I've got my rocker arm and there's a little bit of clearance right here. So I'm gonna make sure that that clearance is set properly. Typically, unlike this one, you're gonna have an adjuster. The one here you can see is for a hydraulic, doesn't have an adjuster. But what that allows me to do is unlock the tension on the nut there, and then I can use an Allen and screw this adjuster in or out, which causes the pivot to move and take up or add more clearance there as needed. So as the engine gets hotter or colder and it's expanding and contracting, that little gap in there that we call Lash is gonna be changing. And the thing is, the Lash actually affects the performance of the engine, because you can look at your cam card all day long, but the only thing that the engine really knows about is not how many degrees there are in the lobe, but what number of those degrees actually gets transmitted through the valve train to the valve, because your pistons are going up and down and trying to get airflow, but they can only get that airflow when the intake valve is open, and then they can only get rid of that airflow when the exhaust valve is open. So we want to get those valves open and closed at the right time in the engine cycle to make sure the engine gives us the performance that we want. All right, so one of the first things we got to get straight is that most people want to talk about camshafts relative to cam card values of things like lift, duration, intake and exhaust centerline angles, and things like lobe separation angle. And while those are important and they're cool, they're not what actually makes the engine run. In fact, what really makes the engine run is the valve time. The problem is we're given the cam card in lobe timing, right? So I got my camshaft, I cut one off here so we could see it, but theoretically what I have is a cam card that's telling me the degrees of crankshaft duration that the lobe is off the base circle. Not necessarily when the valve is open or closed, because that has a little something to do with your rocker arm and what we call rocker ratio, right? So if we take the length in the front of the pivot, or the pivot length here versus the tail shaft, right? This is my trunnion, and take those two as a ratio, you get a rocker arm ratio. That's multiplying whatever is happening at the lobe through our lifter and push rod. So I might have 250 degrees of duration on my cam card, but really what the valve sees is more than that if we consider the rocker ratio. So that's really important for us to understand first. But there's 4 main events that are going to affect the way the engine runs. We're gonna have the intake valve opening, and that's based on angle. It's gonna be on my cam card. I'm gonna have the intake valve closing, the exhaust valve opening, and the exhaust valve closing. When it comes to picking camshafts and understanding what all those events do, there's a lot that goes into it, especially based on the rest of the environment of the engine and the vehicle that I'm gonna be running in. But in terms of order of importance, most people would not argue, if you're on the inside of this deal, what if I was to say, of those 4 events, the most important event that really tends to predict where your power curve is gonna settle down is probably gonna be intake valve closing. It's because the intake stroke is one of the more difficult ones to do. It's hard to convince air to get inside that engine. One of the challenges that we have when I talk about having 8 one-cylinder engines is the fact that our intake runner manifold lengths and port lengths they're not always the same. We have the cylinders in the middle of the engine and we have the cylinders way out on the end of the engine. Now take for example, I've got this beautiful Wilson Manifolds custom intake that was perfectly designed for my Project Spinal Tap 2.0 11,000 RPM engine. Everything in one of those kind of packages gotta be perfect. So it's really wide and spread out. But a lot of times, if you just have say a single 4-barrel manifold like this Edelbrock Victor Jr. here, what you end up with is the runners in the middle are real short and the runners way out the end, they're really long. So one of the things that happens is when you get the piston down to bottom dead center, and then it's stopped, it's no longer drawing air into the engine. We're relying on the momentum of that incoming air charge to hopefully continue filling the cylinder. But as that piston starts to go up from bottom dead center, we're gonna have a battle going on here between how much effort, force, pressure, momentum, whatever word you want to use there, of that incoming air has versus what the energy of the piston is trying to do as it's pushing this air back up. Once those two flip sides and what's inside the cylinder gets way more than what's outside the cylinder, you won't be filling the cylinder, you'll be emptying it. So it's really going to be time to close that intake valve then. So what happens is, for a given engine speed, the amount of air you get pushing itself into the engine under momentum has a lot to do with the length of that intake tract, runner. And so when I've got this Wilson manifold where all of them are almost exactly the same versus this Victor Jr. where I've got long ones and short ones, generally what tends to happen is the longer the runner is, the lower the engine speed where it's gonna make, or it's gonna wanna make its peak torque. So theoretically, when I have a really long intake runner, I'm probably gonna wanna close my intake valve earlier. If I have a short runner, I'm gonna wanna close the valve later, and that also tends to correspond to engine speed ranges. Short runners tend to be really high RPM, and so does a later intake valve closing. Long runners do the opposite. They tend to focus on the lower engine speeds, and so we have an earlier intake valve closing. We can look at the exhaust valve opening the same way, the exhaust valve closing, my overlap period. All of these things are based on the total length that the air has to travel to get into or out of my engine. Well, knowing that not all engines are perfect and not every cylinder is doing the same job, in a perfect world, what I'd have is a camshaft that has different intake and exhaust lobe timing values for each cylinder based on its individual needs across the RPM range. And so we start getting really sophisticated on some of these high-end expensive race engines where it's worth the effort to do that. But for most people, it would be a really expensive tool steel or billet camshaft that it would take to do that. So one of the tricks that we use in tuning camshafts for the engine and also in camshaft development to help us figure out what the engine wants. Does it want a little more duration, a little less duration, earlier, later? We tend to move the camshaft events around. So on our cam card, it gives me the lift and the duration and the lobe separation angle and all that, but it also gives me those 4 events where they happen in order. I'm gonna take you over to the board here in a minute, and we're gonna sort of map some of those out. But what you need to know is when we talk about degreeing a camshaft, I get my cam from the cam guy, I look at my card, put it in the engine, line up all the dots, and hopefully everything happens the way it was supposed to. But by degreeing in the camshaft, what I'm really doing is I'm measuring and sort of investigating if everything in my system ended up the way the cam card said it was supposed to. Or maybe I put it in and it's not what the cam card said, so I want to make some adjustments. Or sometimes I just want to adjust it away from the cam card to see how the engine responds. So let's go over to the board and take a look at how the numbers on the cam card work. Then we'll talk about how we can manipulate them using our Lash. All right, here we go with everybody's least favorite part. It's kind of the math, and understanding the cam card gets a little confusing, but I'll try to make it easy for you. Let's just focus on the 4 events right now, right? So if I look at this cam card, it tells me duration. Now remember, this is duration at my cam lobe, not necessarily at the valve, but it says the intake is 276 degrees, and it says that my exhaust here is 294 degrees, okay? Now, if I relate that to my 4 events, what I'm gonna have is intake valve open, I'm gonna have intake valve close, I'm gonna have exhaust valve open and exhaust valve close. So I can look on my card here and it gives me the valve timing events at 50 thousandths of an inch. So what that means is as my camshaft's coming around and the little wheel on the roller of my lifter is riding along, if I'm on the bottom, on the base circle of the camshaft, I have no lift. So at some point we got to start counting duration, which means that I have something other than no lift. And so the problem is it's really hard to zoom in and find, what's not zero. How many decimal points do I want to go? 0.0000007, 0.0000001. You got to pick a spot, right? So they picked a spot that was 0.050, 50 thousandths of an inch. When that lifter goes up, we start counting. We roll the crankshaft around from that point, which we call intake valve open or exhaust valve open, and we go all the way until it reaches the maximum lift and it comes back down. Now, when it settles back down to 50 thousandths of an inch, we stop counting. Anything below that doesn't get included in these numbers. That's your duration at 50 thou is 276 and 294, right? So they give me some numbers here. They say the intake valve opens at a number of 24. Now that's degrees, and the title is before top dead center. That means think about what's happening. I'm on the end of my exhaust stroke, so my exhaust valve is still open while I'm pushing the old exhaust out. In order to give the engine a little bit of a head start to start pulling air in on the next cycle, before the exhaust valve closes, I'm on the way up, going towards top dead center. I'm gonna get started opening that intake valve 24 degrees before top dead center. Now think about what happens after that. I'm gonna reach top dead center. My piston's gonna start going down, and I'm gonna travel from top dead center all the way to bottom dead center. That's 180 degrees. My intake valve then closes at 72 degrees after bottom dead center. So this duration of 276 degrees is pretty simple. It comes from the 24 degrees before top dead center, the 180 degrees between top dead center and bottom dead center, and then the 72 after bottom dead center. So 24 plus 180 plus 72, you get 276 degrees. Now let's look at our exhaust side and do the same thing. Exhaust valve now, the exhaust valve is opening towards the end of my power stroke. So I go to top dead center, light my spark plug, boom, I have combustion. The gases are expanding, the piston's going down. Somewhere before I get to bottom dead center, I'm gonna open the exhaust valve to give it that same head start. In this case, it's a long way before bottom dead center. This one, exhaust valve opens at 81 degrees before I get to bottom dead center. Now, bottom dead center, from there, the piston's gonna start pushing the exhaust gases out, go all the way to top dead center. That's another 180 degrees, right? I'm gonna put that here in the middle. And then my exhaust valve closes at 33 degrees after top dead center. So 81 plus 180 plus 33, I get 294 degrees. Now, when you look at your cam card, you can also see what we call the overlap period. That's the time when both of the valves are open at exactly the same moment, right? I'm at the end of my exhaust stroke, I'm beginning my intake stroke, the piston's coming up near top dead center, and both valves are open. We can see that because my exhaust valve is still open after top dead center, but my intake valve opened it before top dead center. So really, if you want to know how much overlap we have, we can add those two together. Intake is 24 before top dead center, plus the exhaust happening 33 after top dead center would be 57 degrees of overlap, okay? So now let's talk about what happens when we degree in our cam and people talk about advancing it or retarding it. So literally we're talking about adjusting the alignment between the gear or cog or belt on your crankshaft and the gear or cog or belt on your camshaft, right? So whether you have a belt drive, a gear drive, or a chain and sprockets, doesn't really matter. The alignment there is always a ratio of 2 to 1. The crankshaft's going around twice, the cam's going around once, and so we just have to line them up so that all these events happen. But if I take the alignment and adjust it by advancing the camshaft, what happens is I'm making everything in my card happen earlier. So let's just say, for example, I wanted to advance 2 degrees. So if I advance 2 degrees, it means everything starts earlier. So instead of 24 degrees before top dead center, this would become 26 degrees before bottom dead center. However, my intake valve closing is currently happening 72 degrees after bottom dead center because it's going to close sooner now. It's going to be closer to bottom dead center and it will become 70. So 26 plus 70 and the 180, I would still have the same 276 degrees of duration, but my events would have happened earlier. Now, because this is a V8 and my lobes are all on the same camshaft, whatever I do to the intake happens over here to the exhaust as well. So here, my exhaust number would get bigger because I'm before bottom dead center. So that 2 degrees here makes this 83, and this closes more near to top dead center, so that would become 31. So 83, 31, and 180, I'd still have my 294, but now everything happens 2 degrees earlier. So again, if we go back to our discussion of why you might want earlier or later, it depends on that individual cylinder's want for airflow. If I've got a really long runner, I'm probably gonna want those events to happen earlier. If I've got a really short runner, I'm probably gonna wanna have those events happen later. But each cylinder's got its own little behavior, and by manipulating these values, advancing and retarding, we can make some cylinders happy and some cylinders sad. So now what we got to do is figure out how could we change the cam timing for each individual cylinder. All right, now the thing about Lash is, remember, the only thing the engine knows is what gets translated from the lobe, or what's on my cam card, to the actual valve. So that lifter comes up, moves the push rod moves the rocker arm touches the valve. But as you can imagine, if I take my feeler gauge and I stack a bunch of them together and I stick that in there and I make this gap even bigger, let's say I put a lot of Lash, I'm gonna say I added Lash to the system, now my camshaft is moving and my lifter is moving and my push rod is moving and my rocker arm is moving, but my valve is not. So effectively what happens is when I add Lash to the system and open up this gap to the engine, it feels like I put in a smaller duration camshaft, right? So let me throw these guys over here, make some drawings on the board. So if I was to go like this and show my cam lobe here, now I've got my intake and my exhaust, and here's the period where both valves are open. I got some overlap period in there. So what would happen is, as a general rule of thumb, for most solid lifter camshafts, if you add 2 thousandths of extra clearance in the Lash, it behaves like about 1 degree difference in camshaft. So let's say that I went in and I added 4 thousandths of Lash. So 4 thou of Lash is gonna make my camshaft feel about 2 degrees smaller. So if I take my feeler gauge, back the adjuster off, and move that rocker up an extra 4 thousandths, that 276 is now gonna behave like a 274. But the way that's gonna work, and my exhaust obviously is gonna be a 292 then, so it's like I just put a smaller camshaft everywhere in the engine. But the way that's gonna work is, if we look at our center line here, I got Lash on the opening side and on the closing side. So effectively, the part in the middle stays the same, and it's gonna move both of these ends in. So it would make these events something like, let's see, I'm gonna shorten this up so it'll be 23 degrees before top dead center, and then 71 degrees after bottom dead center. But here's the thing, if I do that, let's say I go in and put that 4 thou everywhere on every rocker arm in the engine, all 4 of my events have now changed. So if I'm dyno testing and the engine actually behaves differently, which event actually did it? Well, I don't know. The reality is, what would be cool is if I had an unlimited number of camshafts and I could just have a bunch of piles of cams that only one event changes, and then I put them in and I run the engine and I change it and put it in and run the engine. That's just not really realistic. You'd have to have a ton of money and a ton of time to do that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start manipulating what I do with the Lash and what I do with the camshaft phasing, or what we talked about earlier with adjusting, advancing, or retarding that value. What I could do, for example, is let's say that I want to move only my intake opening event, right? So what I could do is I could put that 4 thou of Lash in there. So my camshaft's gonna get 2 degrees smaller, but that means my 24 becomes 23 and my 72 becomes 71. So if I did that, and I could advance or retard, so I put 2 degrees, so what I could do is I could advance or retard the camshaft by 1 and move. Instead of having 1 over here and 1 over here, I can shift everything so this event stays the same that it was, and this one gets 2 degrees. So for example, if I put 4 thou Lash in and advance the cam 1 degree, it would put my intake valve opening back to the same spot, but now my exhaust or my intake valve closing would happen 2 degrees early instead of only 1. So when I run the engine, I'm like, well, the one thing that is the engine changed, and I want to know, was it more sensitive to the intake valve opening or the intake valve closing? I could then go back and make a dyno pull and then reverse the order. Keep that lash, but now go back to the middle and retard 1 degree and put this one, 2 degrees different and put this one back where it was going. Now this works really good if you've got dual overhead cams, a Coyote or an import engine, where unfortunately they're not like this one. Unfortunately, when I do anything to this, the whole camshaft has to move. If I advance it, I can't just advance the intake side. It's kind of the intake and the exhaust. But what you can see is that I could play with each individual cylinder and only put lash in the intake, or only put lash in the exhaust, or I could put a different amount of lash in either side. And you can start individually tweaking and tuning the engine's actual timing events by using the lash and the advancing and retarding of the camshaft. All right, I know this can get confusing and sound complicated, but it's really not. Really what it means is you could just go in there on the dyno and play around with the lash on individual cylinders and move the camshaft forwards and backwards, plot out your numbers, and pretty soon this will seem a lot easier, and you'll figure out that if I put 4 degrees of lash in and advance the cam 2 degrees, it holds one steady and moves the other side. If I put that same 4th thou of lash in it and then retard the cam 2 degrees, it does exactly the opposite. So I encourage you to play around with that, but I want to point out something real quick before you go down this road and grab your wrenches and your feeler gauges. I don't want to get you in trouble without making sure you understand what that ramp, that lash ramp on the lobe actually looks like. So imagine, if you would, I've got a camshaft lobe. Looks kind of like this, right? And the lash ramp is the part here where we're talking about right at the bottom, where we're coming off of no lift and going up. And so that clearance ramp in here is designed, depending on the application, to be either really, really slow and smooth or sometimes really aggressive. While this isn't a guaranteed indicator of how angry or how mild a camshaft is, one of the things that you can look at is called the major intensity of the camshaft, right? So the major intensity is defined, if we look on our cam card, they actually give us the duration twice. Once on my solid cam here, they give me the duration at 20 thou of tappet lift, and once they give it to me at 50 thou. And so you get what's called the 20 thou numbers, what we call the advertised duration. I always feel like they're advertised because the marketing and advertising guys, they like big numbers, big camshaft cells. So the advertised numbers are typically bigger than the duration at 50 numbers you're gonna get, and you can see why. If I'm coming along at 0, if I start counting here at 0.20 and go all the way back to 0.20, it's gonna have a farther distance than if I wait until I'm up here at 0.50 and come back down on this side to 0.50. So the major intensity is the number of crank degrees between the difference in those two. For example, I'm gonna look at these two cams. Now this is what's interesting. On cam 1, I have a 20 thou, 0.20 intake duration of 309 degrees. That's starting at 20, going all the way back to 20. But when I get to my 50 thou duration, 0.050, it's 276. Sorry about my handwriting, guys. 276. So let's see. That would be 76 to 300 is something like 14, I think, and then another 24, and then 9 gives me about 33 degrees of what we'd call major intensity. Now, typically, if you have a symmetrical cam, those numbers are split because you got half of it over here and half of it over there. You can definitely get into a lot of asymmetric profiles where we're doing a little, shuffling it over, so I'm a little slower opening and fast closing, or maybe I'm really fast opening and slower closing, but for the most part, that major intensity is there. Now, this is what's cool. Take the other camshaft here, and it is also 276 degrees at 50, right? However, this one is 313 degrees of of lift and duration, at 20 thou. So now my difference here, I was still 276 and 276. However, I have a lot longer going 313 than 309. It's actually 4 degrees longer. So this one has a major intensity of 37 degrees. Now again, it can be all mixed up from exactly equal or fast here, slow there, slow here, fast there. The point that I'm making is this though. The larger the major intensity number is, the more likely it is that where you land on this lash ramp won't matter that much. And what I mean by that is if you get into a situation where you're adding a lot of lash clearance, you're giving the rocker arm a lot of wind up time. That lobe starts moving and it's like having a wiffle ball at the end of the holding stick there, and you got your wiffle ball bat and you're getting a big swing at it, right? If you start real close to the ball, you can't whack it quite as hard. So what can happen if you're not careful is you can get too much lash and really kind of upset your valve train and start breaking springs or, you know, damaging things like that. So you want to be a little careful with how much lash you get. But when your major intensity numbers start to get really small, it narrows up the tuning window that you can use for lash. So the camshaft manufacturers know this. That's why on the card they suggest how much lash you should have. So for example, this one over here, both cams are 276 duration. One of them suggests the intake lash be 16 thousandths of an inch. The other one suggests 25 thousandths of an inch. That's a big change, about 9 thousandths of an inch of lash to change those lash ramps. Keep in mind that that also has to do with what rocker arm ratio you're using and all the other factors in the engine. That's why this is a really cool, kind of sophisticated tuning tool that you can use. So just know that if you start getting really aggressive profiles, imagine if I had a camshaft that came along and went like this, right? This super steep. Well, you'd have to get the lash point just right. And so as your major intensity numbers get smaller, your lash adjustment tuning window also gets smaller. You can't be very aggressive on having a lot of lash and a super steep ramp. If you have a nice slow moving, like on an exhaust valve ramp, you could put the lash at 10 or 40 and it probably doesn't make a lot of difference. But just something I wanted you to know about before you go in there with your wrenches and start tuning. All right, so obviously there's a lot to take in here, and you could probably see that if I was doing individual cylinder tuning on a dyno and I've got combustion analysis and all the in-cylinder pressure transducers, it's a lot easier to figure out where to go. But one of the things I really like about this method of individual cylinder tuning is you can do it for free. You can go in there and run the engine on the dyno and just change the lash on the whole engine, do all the intakes and the exhaust and do a dyno pull, see what happens. Then maybe only change the lash on the intake side and do a dyno pull, see what happens. Now with that lash, advance and retard, take some notes, let the engine tell you what it wants, and just like you would read spark plugs or O2 sensors and start building yourself an individual cylinder tune-up, you could literally do the same thing with the lash on your camshaft. You could end up with not only a different amount of lash on the intake and the exhaust side, but in each individual cylinder, you might find a combination that works best for that. I hope you like that, and I hope you'll go out and try it and let me know what you think about it in the comments. But for now, thanks for watching, and get out there and start tuning.